this idea that Noel Coward is so drawn into the legend, the living legend that is Mountbatten. And he's like, he just can't wait to cozy up to this man's man. You know, he's a really great man. His judgment is sound and rational in every major issue. Yeah, except for maybe not signaling to the enemy where your ship is, then sending out a message that basically invites a fight, getting your ship destroyed, and then having to get other people to help tow you in for 91 hours out of enemy territory. It's just like, what are you talking about, sound and rational? You're only getting the story from one side, and this Joker really knows how to play up his own hand. So of course he's going to let you think he's sound and rational. Hello, welcome to my channel. My name is Cheer Denise. Today we're going to be doing chapter 12 of the Mountbattens, and this chapter is called Combined Operations. It follows right on the heels of the last chapter where we learned about Dickie taking command of the HMS Kelly. He managed to destroy that ship, and we have numerous stories in the last chapter of various times when the Navy sent him to do something, and instead of doing it the way he had been taught to do it, he would create some new way of doing it and destroy his ship in the process. Numerous times it was repaired, he'd be sent out and destroyed again. Yet somehow, despite the fact that he showed no judgment or patience in the face of catastrophe, he continued to be known as somebody who had great seamanship, even though many of the terrible situations he found himself in and then somehow heroically managed to save the ship were always his fault. Numerous times things had gone awry because he did the wrong thing. Then he managed to get the attention, the important people's attention to the right things he had done. And somehow the terrible things he had done, the great mishaps, the great mistakes, the great fumbles of wisdom were just sort of pushed to the wayside so that, well, we need the morale boost of him having done at least something right. So we'll just highlight that. So he continues to build his legend. Over the course of that chapter, we're seeing over and over and over again him doing something dumb, but having the connections so that the good things he did are spun and highlighted to create this whole like propaganda machine about him. So he manages to get the attention of Churchill, who seems to become a great fan. At this point, it looks like he admires Dickie. Now, at one point, he had pulled Dickie in and said, what if you came and you worked for us, not necessarily as a commander on a ship, but you came here and you helped us run the show over here. But he didn't want to. He wanted to be out on a ship. And part of me is wondering, was that like a play to get him out of the water where he was causing so much damage? Or did they really think that he had superior knowledge? Now, the last chapter, it also ended with us finding that he was now not going to be in charge of a destroyer any longer. No. We've got bigger plans for you. Let's put you on an aircraft carrier. You now get to take care of the aircraft carrier where there's even more stuff for you to ruin. So while we're all reeling from that, we find at the very end of the book that actually they have a different job for him. No, not the aircraft carrier, something else. So this is the chapter where we find out what his new job is. It's not a very long chapter, so this is going to be a short episode. But this chapter is divided into two parts. The first part talks about when he joined Combined Operations Headquarters and what he made of that, which I will say he does get credit for really building that into a thing. And then the second half of the chapter, we're going to talk about this movie that his friend Noel Coward wanted to make about him. And in this movie, it's very clearly Dickie Mountbatten. He thinly veils who he is in the movie, but it's the thinnest of veils. Everyone knew that the movie was about Dickie. There are various scenes in which he's giving speeches, where he's giving speeches that are like word for word, verbatim, things that Dickie had said. Various stories are told in the movie that mirror things that people knew about him. The story about the stoker who doesn't do his job, and then Dickie's like, you didn't do your job, but really it's my fault for not being the leader you needed, and that kind of a thing. I mean, everyone knew that was a Dickie Mountbatten story. So we'll talk about that when we get there. But anyway, it's a short chapter, so it's not a long one. And then later this weekend, I'm hoping to get at least 2 episodes out about Harry and Meghan. Remember, I don't know if you saw it, but I'm going to be going over that old documentary about Harry and Meghan. It came out 2 years ago, and I could not be bothered to watch it because I was in the trenches of Spare and then Revenge, and I was like, I can't do any more of these people. So I didn't do it. But since I'm reviewing shows, it doesn't make sense that this channel would not talk about that documentary. So I'm going to do it, you guys. I'm going to do it. But anyway, that's later this week. But for right now, Mountbattens. The chapter begins by saying combined operations had been formed in July 1940 under Admiral of the Fleet Sir Roger Keyes to plan amphibious operations against the Germans. Keyes had already organized a few raids on the French coast and was training some 500,000 men and 10 commandos. But his reporting responsibilities had been left vague. Was he responsible directly to Churchill as Minister of Defense or to the Chiefs of Staff? He couldn't decide, so that created a lot of tensions. And the Chiefs of Staff felt that he should be giving them more information than he was giving Churchill, so they decided to dismiss him in 1941. Plus, it was clear they just needed somebody younger. This man was almost 70, and so it seemed like they needed some more dynamic ideas, someone younger, and there was somebody that they knew of. Dickie Mountbatten. So his principal task, as new head of the combined operations, was to prepare for the invasion of France, organize training areas and troops, develop weaponry, and select an invasion site. As part of that preparation, he was to conduct a series of morale-boosting small raids to probe defenses, destroy or capture key facilities, and harass the enemy, and advise on larger raids under the control of the Chiefs of Staff. He also attended Chiefs of Staff meetings as a, quote, technical advisor when combined operations was on the agenda. Well, when Mountbatten took over combined operations, it was a measly team of 23 people, and that included typists and messengers. He's not here for that small show. When he shows up, he's like, okay, let's get the show on the road. This is pathetic. Let's go. And so he immediately made changes to personnel and communications. He insisted that it was a totally integrated service with the first loyalty to combined operations and not to the parent service, and successfully arranged to work with overlapping organizations, such as the Special Operations Executive. He created 4 separate areas on the operational side: planning, intelligence, training, and communications. By the new year, it had expanded from its single floor at Richmond Terrace to take over much of nearby Scotland Yard, and within 6 months, the staff of combined headquarters had grown to 400 people. So, nothing small scale for old Dickie. Now, Dickie liked to muck around in the ugly world of hiring your friends and relatives. And the first thing he did was bring on a whole crew of his own cronies. Peter Murphy was brought in to look at the political implications of the various operations. And you just have to raise an eyebrow to that because Peter was a well-known communist. So I don't know if his political opinion should count much in a non-communist country, but all right. Then there was Harold Werner, George Milford Haven's brother-in-law, and he dealt with procurement. There was Mickey Hodges, an old Navy friend who was in charge of signals. And then, against all understandable odds, Dickie decided to bring in the old racing car chum, who was really more of a friend of Edwina's, the Marquis of Casamarie. And that guy was made head of intelligence. Why was the race car driver head of intelligence? I mean, we have been given no information about a background that would lead us to believe he had any abilities there, but all right. The book says that Mountbatten always felt safest working with a close-knit group of glamorous friends, and they came to be dubbed as Dickie's friends, whom he could dominate and trust, but this was rarely popular or effective. There was actually 3 novelists who served in the combined operations: Robert Henry Case, do we say Henry Case? I think so. Then Evelyn Waugh and Neville Shute. And he was intrigued by Mountbatten's total inability to judge men correctly, whether they were his cronies or his subordinates, and yet with the power to command an uncritical loyalty from almost everyone. Hugh Dalton, the Minister of Economic Warfare, noted worries in his diary that Mountbatten had, quote, surrounded himself with a group of his personal friends, most of whom are not very good at their jobs. So that was sort of like this underlying sense that he just had a bunch of people hanging around so that it was just like one big party for Mountbatten. You know, you got all his cronies, all his friends. He would tell them what to do. They would do it. They all admired him so. And they were an easy group to bend their wishes and wills to his own. But he's also a really confusing person. It's very hard to analyze him because while he did sleazy things like hire all his friends so he can like pal around all day, the reality is he did have a skill set. He was very good at a lot of things. So he's a slippery person to try to handle and try to sort of pigeonhole as to whether he's good or bad, because there were things he did extraordinarily well. And then there were things he did that were stupid. I mean, we saw that in the last chapter. Whereas he was a good seaman and he did have great abilities in commanding other people and getting them to bend to his will and do what he wanted. In the face of danger, he didn't seem to be able to make heads or tails of a wise decision. In this situation here, he's grown this combined operations from 23 to 400 people. And he's going to go on to do a lot of things that people were nodding their heads at and feeling that he had done right. But at the same time, he's an enormously micromanaging boss. And I think that it would have been very difficult to work for somebody like this. All right. But the book goes on to describe him. He says that Mountbatten, an inventor of gadgets, was one of the most technically highly trained naval officers of his generation, and he immediately saw the need to bring in combined operations scientists who, as he never tired of saying, did not, quote, have staff college minds. And though left-leaning, they proved to be a great success, not least at the Normandy landings, covering such diverse subjects as the use of drugs to prevent seasickness, how to improve night vision, ration packets for commandos, the physiological consequence of explosions, and the minimum safe distance from an underwater explosion. And while they were tackling all these big subjects and seeming to have a fairly good stab at their offerings, Mountbatten, through a mixture of charm and ruthlessness, proved to be a decisive, forward-thinking commander, with an ability to unite opposing factions in a common cause. And while he built up a good working relationship with the chiefs of staff, it did not always make him popular. He had no hesitation in going above people's heads, often dropping the names of the Prime Minister and the King to achieve his ends, and his staff found he involved himself in unnecessary intrigue. I don't know what that means, unless, does it mean that he was kind of like a drama queen, always stirring up contentions, bringing up things that were sort of flimsy and unimportant? He could not resist micromanaging and obsessing about minor details, and he would delegate tasks to the staff, and then they would find that he had impatiently gone ahead and just done them himself. It became known as, quote, doing a Lord Louis. Man, there is nothing worse than being manhandled by a micromanager who spends all this time shaming you for not getting a thing done, and then when you go try to get it done, they've already done it, just so they can rub your face in the fact that they got to it before you. So annoying. I've definitely dealt with people like that. And it isn't that you're being a procrastinator and not getting things done. It's like it's one thing if you aren't doing things and they have to like come up around behind you because you took forever to do it. You know, shame on a person who finds himself in that situation. But I'm talking about the boss who mentions it to you, then you try to go do it and they're like, I had to do it myself. And you're like, you literally just told me to do it. I have absolutely found myself in those situations. The book goes on to say that a whole series of raids had initially been considered by combined operations, only to be discounted as infeasible. However, within weeks of his appointment, Mountbatten had organized the first of 10 raids of varying sizes, which took place in the initial 6 months of 1942. The first was a small raid off the coast of southern Norway, and the objective was the destruction of fish oil productions and stores that the Germans used in the manufacture of high explosives. This operation was called Operation Archery, and it was especially significant because it was the first operation jointly planned and executed by all three services, and it was in fact a pinch operation to seize an Enigma machine. And as Mountbatten continues to organize these raids, his legend grows. In February, parachute troops were dropped onto the cliff top at Brunneval, demolishing the radar station and capturing key equipment. At the end of the month, the dry dock at St. Nazaire, where it was feared the German battleship Tirpitz might shelter, was destroyed by an obsolete destroyer packed with explosives being used to ram the lock gates, killing over 400 Germans. The raid has always been seen as one of the successes of combined operations, and one for which Mountbatten took full credit. But it came at a high price, with only 4 of the 18 coastal craft that sailed returning. Over half of those who went ashore were captured and a quarter killed, and many more seriously wounded. After the fall of Singapore and amidst Rommel's growing victories in North Africa, it was an Allied morale boost. 5 Victoria Crosses were awarded. But it bred a dangerous confidence in Combined Operations Headquarters, which was to have disastrous consequences only a few months later. That's the part that I just don't get. I don't understand how it is. Explain it to me, people. How is it that Dickie continues to do things with massively negative consequences, and yet people tack it on to him as this great victory. And they're like, look what Louis did. Lord Louis, he's the best. He's the best. Look at him. We're so proud. And it's like, but yes, I get that it was a success. Germans, I guess, were killed here, so your objective was realized. But at what cost? It seems weird to me that he made such an effort to get to know people on a very personal level. And then when it came down to whether their life was of value to him, he doesn't always seem like he valued it. Now, I'm not saying he knew all the guys on all 18 coastal craft that were sent out, but I'm talking about like on his own ship. It was weird how little he valued the men's lives, and those men he knew well and had taken an effort to get to know them. Was that all in an effort to manipulate them better because they would look at him as a friend? But in this scenario, here we have him sending out 18 coastal craft, and it says here that only 4 returned, and that there was all these people, killed and seriously wounded, yet he wants to rush to take full credit for this. Was it because he knew that he'd be able to rewrite the narrative so that no one ever really needed to look at the consequences of the raid that he created? I'm no military expert. I understand the loss of life was extraordinary in World War II, far apart from what the enemy did to us, what we would sometimes end up doing to ourselves. The attrition rate in the Air Force in the Pacific was ridiculous. The stuff that happened to the bombers flying all over the Pacific, many of those airplanes were lost not due to the enemy, but because of operator error, storms, friendly fire. Like there's all kinds of stuff that happened. So I'm not saying that there's no chance that any of this played into what's happening here. It is entirely possible that much of this loss of life wasn't directly due to Louis Mountbatten, but to the ravages of war, to the tragedy of all the accidents that often happen in war that have nothing to do with enemies fighting back and forth. But it's just weird to me how often he wants to jump to gaining credit for things that actually were quite negative if you look at the stats. The operations, in all reality, inflicted little damage on the Germans. But they were important for morale, and they did much to enhance Mountbatten's reputation, not least with Churchill, who shared his buccaneering spirit and offensive attitude. In March, Churchill made Mountbatten then a junior captain and chief of combined operations with the acting rank of vice admiral. This made him the youngest since Nelson. And he was a lieutenant general and an air marshal, which, by the way, only the king also held rank in all 3 services. So that was quite a feather in Mountbatten's cap. He was able to sit as the 4th chief of staff and attend to all meetings of the chiefs of staff committee as a full member. So now he wasn't just a representative of combined headquarters, he's actually a member of the chiefs of staff. The chief of the Imperial General Staff, General Sir Alan Brooke, was not impressed. He wrote in his diary, "Informed by the PM that I am to take over the chairmanship of the COS from Dudley Pound, and that Mountbatten is to be additional member of the COS." He wrote in his diary on March 5th, "Rather doubtful how that business will run!" But then he added, Mountbatten's inclusion in the chiefs of staff was a snag. There was no justification for this move. His appointment as chief of combined operations was excellent, and he certainly played a remarkable role as the driving force and mainspring of this organization. Without his energy and drive, it would never have reached the high standards it achieved. However, the holding of this appointment was no reason for his inclusion in the COS, where he frequently wasted both his own time and ours. But the appointment was good news for combined operations. It gave them a lot more influence at the center of decision-making. Now they no longer just had to send somebody to sit there and listen to the chiefs of staff talking. They have one of their own on the board. The rest of the chapter is dedicated to the making of the film that was to memorialize Mountbatten on film. Somebody said in the comments that a lot of the decisions that Dickie made seemed to reflect his desire for his life to be a movie. And some of the roguish decisions he was making in an effort to be a maverick sort of illustrate the desire that he had to live life as though he is the star of his own movie. So when Noel Coward came to him and said, "Hey, let's make a movie about your life," he was like, "Down for it, man, let's go." At the beginning of July 1941, on his return from Crete, Mountbatten had seen Noel Coward and told him the whole story of the sinking of the Kelly. "Absolutely heartbreaking and so magnificent," Coward wrote in his diary. He told the whole saga without frills and with a sincerity that was very moving. He's a pretty wonderful man, I think. Now, this may be neither here nor there, but we know that Noel Coward was gay. And there's a part of me that just feels like he fantasized and idolized Mountbatten. That he looked at him as like this real man's man who could take charge and all of this, and hearing him tell the story about how the ship went down. And, it's a very harrowing tale. They say that the ship went down and the last anybody saw of Mountbatten, it was him standing at the bow of the boat as it's sinking. I mean, it's like quite the image. And Dickie enjoying film the way he did and being a very good storyteller, probably told it in a very rousing way with the added benefit of knowing to hold back so that his audience would think that he was really struggling with what had happened, but he was going to tell it to you in a straightforward manner. He was going to give it to you without any frills. He wasn't going to try to manipulate you, all the while manipulating you with his reduction in emotion. Okay, well, Coward, keen to make a propaganda film about the Navy, raised the idea a few weeks later with Mountbatten, who was very enthusiastic. At the end of July, the two worked up the idea at Broadlands, and during August, Coward drafted a script. The film was originally to be called White Ensign, but was later changed to In Which We Serve from one of the morning naval prayers. He writes Quiet Dinner, Edwina, Dickie, and Lady Milford Haven. Long discussion with Dickie on general war situation and our naval losses. More and more convinced that he is a great man. His judgment seems to me to be sound and rational on every major issue. Except the ones where it counts. Discussed film script, which he has read, and was highly gratified that there were so few technical mistakes. Brief but hilarious lesson in naval deportment, salutes, etc. You just get this idea that Noel Coward is so drawn into the legend, the living legend that is Mountbatten. And he's like, he just can't wait to cozy up to this man's man. He's a really great man. His judgment is sound and rational in every major issue. Yeah, except for maybe not signaling to the enemy where your ship is, then sending out a message that basically invites a fight, getting your ship destroyed, and then having to get other people to help tow you in for 91 hours out of enemy territory. It's just like, what are you talking about, sound and rational? You're only getting the story from one side, and this joker really knows how to play up his own hand, so of course he's going to let you think he's sound and rational. But I just think that Noel is he's just hazy-eyed over this. The film was making great progress, but then there was an official at the Ministry of Information who raised objections to a war film showing a British ship being sunk, like that was some kind of unique occurrence. And then Dickie marched himself right in there and told the guy off. Coward apparently had witnessed it, and he said Dickie went off like a time bomb. It was one of the most startling and satisfactory scenes I've ever witnessed. I actually felt a pang of compassion for the wretched official, who wilted under the tirade like a tallow candle before a strong fire. Well, they go ahead and they get the film underway. It's being filmed, and even the king and the queen and the princesses came by the set just to say hey and to see how things were. The king wore his naval uniform, and it was all just very exciting. Dickie, always micromanaging, had shown a keen interest in every element of the film's production. The lower deck advisor was his cabin hand, who had been severely burnt when the Kelly was sunk, and he had personally arranged for 200 convalescent patients from the Naval Hospital at Haslar to be used as extras, which is actually pretty cool. But this is the thing that I find the most interesting thing in the entire chapter, which hasn't been exactly riveting. What's interesting is that in the first script, he's married to this person who they call Lady Celia Kinross. And he's living in a house that's even greater and grander than the Broadlands house, and he's got a Rolls Royce and a driver and all of this. It's very evident that this guy is supposed to be a man of wealth and means. But when Mountbatten saw the script, he didn't care for that element. And so he wanted it changed. He objected strongly. So it was changed, and Coward writes back to Louis and says, "My captain is quite ordinary now, with an income of about £800 a year, a small country house near Plymouth, a reasonably nice-looking wife, not a missus, not a lady, 2 children, and a cocker spaniel." Isn't that odd that Mountbatten wanted to strip the story of the things in this fantasy that would mirror the wealth and grandeur that had been brought into his life by Edwina? And that he wants the wife not to be a lady, but just a regular lady. That he doesn't want the house to be this big mansion. That he wants the man to be earning a normal salary and that his life would reflect that. It's like he's almost embarrassed that the grandeur of his life has been brought into his existence because his wife is the one who had the money. But his wife, by the way, is also the one who has ravished his emotions by having all of these affairs. So I just think that as he's trying to, this movie is clearly about him. They make no strides to cover up his identity through his career, but in his personal life, he wants that kind of shrouded in mystery and rewritten. Interesting. If he thought that changing the main character to this sort of middle-class guy with a nice little wife and a couple of kids, and that was going to fool everybody who watched it, it fooled no one. The character was instantly recognizable by all as Mountbatten, down to his mannerisms and even verbatim speeches. Many of the scenes came from Mountbatten's own experiences, most notably when the stoker, played by Richard Attenborough, abandons his post and the captain blames himself for not having successfully inspired the young man with his own heroic values. Was the film a success? It was. The film premiered in September 1942, the first time a premiere had been held on a Sunday, in aid of the Royal Navy Benevolent Trust, and attended by the First Lord of the Admiralty and the Mountbattens. Dickie was thrilled with it, and he saw it twice over the coming weeks, believing it to be a valuable booster of not only the Navy, but national morale at a time of few military victories. It became one of the most popular films of the year, winning an Academy Award. And in the Sunday Times, they called it, quote, the best film about the war yet made in this country or in America. It was one of Churchill's favorite films, and he was only dissuaded from giving Coward a knighthood by concerns that Coward's recent court case on currency speculation would sort of mar things. The film had done Mountbatten's career no harm either. Well, the chapter ends by discussing America's entry into the war. So you'll recall that Mountbatten, when he'd been in America, he'd happened to be in Hawaii, and he said, you guys need to fix this. This is a mess. This is really setting you all up to some attacks because you're very vulnerable in this position. He was by no means the first person to have pointed out the vulnerabilities at Pearl Harbor. But I say that only to say he did try to give what warning he could. And in fact, when Pearl Harbor was hit, they had been in the works of trying to implement some of his suggestions. The entry of America into the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 provided new opportunities and resources for combined operations. Having created a truly integrated headquarters of all three services with a virtual monopoly on amphibious warfare, Mountbatten realized that combined operations needed to embrace the Americans and Canadians. The Russians, joining the Allies after the German invasion in June of 1941, put new pressure on combined operations to hold down German troops on the continent. By the spring of 1942, the Russians were pleading for a divisory landing to divert forces from the Eastern Front. Sholto Douglas and Bernard Paget argued for a landing where there was the shortest crossing with the possibility of strong air cover, but Mountbatten and Combined Operations Headquarters argued that the coast was too heavily defended, and the ports were too shallow, and it would be easy for the Germans to bring in reinforcements. They suggested the less well-fortified port in Normandy, with its open beaches and opportunity to establish a beachhead more easily. The arguments raged on throughout the spring of 1942. Mountbatten was certainly one of the champions of the landings being in Normandy, but whether he was quite the lone voice he later claimed is debatable. In June of 1942, General Dwight D. Eisenhower arrived in London as Commanding General, European Theater of Operations. He and Mountbatten were to work closely together preparing for the invasion of Europe. The two men respected, trusted, and liked each other, and Eisenhower pressed for Mountbatten to be put in charge of Operation Sledgehammer and the subsequent invasion. Throughout 1942, the arguments continued with the timing of the invasion, with Mountbatten arguing that the Allies did not have sufficient resources, especially landing craft, to succeed, but thought was now also being given to a smaller incursion as a holding operation politically. Its target was the French port of Dieppe. The operation was to be one of the most controversial of Mountbatten's career. So that's what the next episode is going to be about. That's it. That's the end of the chapter. But though that probably wasn't the most riveting, it really is necessary for us to know that part of him and the way his career is beginning to escalate in order for us to understand the catastrophe in the next chapter. So that will be coming out later this week, but I do want to get a couple of the episodes of Harry and Meghan out of the way. I think that for most of the shows I think that I review, I'm going to probably condense them a little bit, not do episode after episode after episode, unless it's something that's just really interesting. Now, for the Harry and Meghan, I'm going to do all 6 episodes as their own individual episode on this channel, so we will extend that out. But from now on, I will try to shorten up my reviews of shows just to keep things moving along in the show department. So thank you all for your patience while I've been figuring out some different content ideas just to bring you guys something different, something a little bit more relevant to what we're doing right now. And thank you guys so much for your support about this new Harry and Meghan documentary. Well, it's not new, but it's new to me. I know it's old material. I also know we've talked about Harry and Meghan a lot on this channel, so I wasn't sure if you guys would be up for it again, but your resounding response has let me know that I'm on the right path. So I'm looking forward to doing that with you guys. And we'll, of course, still be reading Mountbatten as we do that. Okay, I'll see you guys later. Thanks for hanging out. Bye.